Racist pilot despised the wrong woman. He didn't know who she was and the power she had. The private airport was buzzing with the movement of executive jets and their crews. Well-dressed men in sharp suits and elegant women rushed by, checking expensive watches and speaking on the phone in firm tones. The atmosphere reflected power and status, a space where every detail exuded exclusivity. Helena Vasconcelos crossed the hall with her head held high, dressed simply but impeccably. Her navy blue blazer, discreet and well-fitted, matched her classic-cut dress pants. In her hands she carried a weathered leather briefcase that seemed to have stories to tell. Her steps were calm, yet carried the confidence of someone who needed to prove nothing to anyone. As she approached the executive aviation counter, however, she sensed the subtle shift in gazes. That brief moment when someone decides whether you belong in that space or not. Pilot Renato Nogueira glanced at her while speaking with one of the crew members. He was a tall man with an imposing presence, accustomed to dealing with high society passengers. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he raised his eyebrows slightly, assessing her with little interest. Experience told him she was probably an assistant to some businessman or at most the wife of one of the clients. "Ma'am, this area is only for passengers of the executive jet PH-567, he said, in a polite but impersonal tone. Helena raised an eyebrow, analyzing the man before her. Her brown eyes shimmered with contained patience, and a small smile formed at the corner of her lips. "I know." Renato waited for her to explain why she was there, but Helena remained silent. She simply held his gaze, as if amused by the discomfort, settling in. The pilot, not fully understanding the situation, turned his attention back to a man who had just approached. He was someone more befitting the profile of the clients he expected to serve. Tailored suit, gleaming watch on his wrist, and the demeanor typical of those used to being catered to. "Sir, welcome. Your plane is ready for boarding," Renato said, with a professional smile. The man blinked in confusion and looked at Helena, who stood beside the counter unmoving. It was then that the company manager appeared, dressed in a dark suit with an expression of absolute reverence. Upon spotting Helena, he broke into a polite smile and hurried to greet her personally. "Dr. Vasconcelos, your jet is ready. We can proceed to the cabin whenever you like." The blood drained from Renato's face. Helena cast one last glance at the pilot before picking up her briefcase and heading for the boarding area. She said nothing, needing no words. Renato's petrified expression and the surprised murmur from the man in the expensive suit spoke volumes. The surrounding atmosphere felt a bit colder, and Ren. He realized he had just made a mistake he might not be able to undo. Renato felt his stomach churn as he watched Helena Vasconcelos walk away with the company's manager. The rhythmic sound of her heels echoed through the silent lobby, each step seeming like a sentence weighing on him. The conversation around him slowly resumed, but furtive glances still fell upon him. He swallowed hard, trying to process what had just happened. What should have been a routine service turned into a humiliating mistake. The fact that he had assumed Helena was merely an assistant or the wife of some client now seemed a glaring and naive error. He had spent years honing his judgment of people, reading passengers by their appearance, gestures, and tone of voice. But at that moment, he realized that his self-confidence had turned into hubris. One of the flight attendants, a young man named Leandro, approached hesitantly. "Captain, is everything all right?" he asked, casting a discreet glance in the direction Helena had disappeared. Renato let out a long sigh, running his hand through his short hair, as if trying to dissipate the tension. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, without conviction. But in truth, nothing was fine. He had heard the name Vasconcelos before. It was a name that circulated in the country's most influential circles. Helena was not just the owner of that jet. She was a respected businesswoman, a reference in her field, someone who would not accept being underestimated. Minutes later, he was called to the hangar to perform the final checks for the flight. His heart raced upon seeing Helena already in the main cabin of the aircraft, with the manager beside her, presenting her with a report on the preparations. Her gaze met his for a moment, but there was no accusation, no aggressive words. Just a silence that spoke louder than any verbal reproach. Renato stepped closer, maintaining his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, we are finalizing the last adjustments for takeoff. We'll have a smooth flight to the destination," he informed her, his voice firm but with an almost imperceptible trace of tension. Helena closed the leather folder she was holding and looked at him, appraising him. "I'm glad to know everything is under control, Commander," she replied calmly. "I'm sure your team is very capable." He nodded, but the way she said those words made his confidence waver. She wasn't just being polite. There was something more there, something that made it clear that this conversation was not yet over. And he knew that at some point during that flight, he would have to face her again. The crew completed the final procedures as the passengers boarded. Helena traveled alone without assistants or companions. Just her and her imposing presence filled the space in a way Renato could not ignore. When everyone was settled, he took his position in the cockpit, preparing for takeoff. The takeoff was flawless, as always. The blue sky stretched ahead, and Renato tried to focus on the flight, pushing away the uncomfortable feeling that he needed to correct his mistake in some way. But he didn't have to wait long for that to happen. Shortly after they reached cruising altitude, Helena requested to speak with the captain. The request, relayed by one of the flight attendants, made his chest tighten. He had no choice. He needed to face her. In the passenger area, Helena was sitting comfortably with a cup of coffee in front of her. She wasn't looking at her phone, didn't review papers, and didn't seem distracted. She was there, waiting for him. Renato squared his shoulders and approached. "Ma'am, you asked to see me," he said, keeping his tone respectful. Helena raised her eyes, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Yes, Captain." "Please have a seat," she said, pointing to the chair in front of her. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. As he sat down, Helena crossed her hands on the table. "Tell me something, Captain," she began, her tone calm but sharp. "How many passengers have you flown with throughout your career?" He frowned slightly, trying to understand where she was going. "I couldn't say exactly, but certainly thousands." She nodded, as if she had already expected that answer. "And in how many of those flights did you judge someone by their appearance, before knowing who they really were?" The question made him hold his breath for a moment. It was direct and incisive, and worst of all, he didn't have a good enough answer. "Ma'am, He started, but she raised a hand, gently interrupting him. "I'm not asking for apologies, Captain. I just want you to reflect," she said, picking up the cup and bringing it to her lips before continuing. "What happened today is not just about me. It's about a pattern, about how many people are underestimated every day because someone decided they didn't seem to fit a certain profile." Renato swallowed hard. He didn't need a lecture. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that what she was saying made sense. Helena observed his expression and smiled slightly. "I don't like unnecessary exposure, Captain. If I wanted to, I could have made a scene in the lobby. I could have drawn attention to your mistake, but that doesn't interest me. What interests me is knowing if you really learned something from this." The silence between them lingered. Renato took a deep breath and finally found his voice. "I have learned, ma'am. And I assure you, it won't happen again." Helena held his gaze for a few more moments before nodding slightly. "I hope so, Captain. Now, if you'll excuse me, I would like to make the most of the rest of the flight." Renato stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation still hanging over him. He knew this wasn't just any conversation. It was a test, and the real challenge was yet to come, to show that his words weren't merely a convenient response, but a real change. Renato returned to the cockpit with a restless mind. Helena Vasconcelos' words echoed in his head, heavy as if each one carried a personal judgment. He had heard criticism before, but none with that weight. That woman wasn't just giving a moralistic speech. She spoke with conviction, as someone who understood exactly the impact of being underestimated. The silence in the cockpit was broken only by the hum of the navigation instruments. Leandro, the young steward, cast him a curious look, noticing. His expression was stiffer than usual. "Everything all right, Commander?" he asked, trying to break the tension. Renato didn't respond immediately. He adjusted one of the controls, glanced at the indicators on the panel, and let out a sigh before finally speaking. Have you ever made a mistake that you realized too late? He asked, keeping his eyes on the endless road of sky ahead of him. Leandro furrowed his brow, clearly not expecting a question of that nature. We all make mistakes, right? The question is what we do afterward. Renato let out a short, humorless laugh. He knew the steward was right, but still felt it wasn't that simple. He had always taken pride in his experience and his ability to read people, but now he realized that same pride made him blind to his own biases. Hours later, the flight continued smoothly. The passengers were settled. In-flight service was running. Smoothly, and for the most part, everything seemed to be going normally. But Renato couldn't relax. He knew he would need to face Helena again when they landed, and worse than that, he knew an apology wouldn't be enough. When the sign for descent was activated, Renato made a decision. As soon as they landed, he would find a way to prove he had learned his lesson. Upon touching down, Helena showed no hurry to exit the plane. She seemed to be waiting for something, as if she knew Renato wouldn't let things simply end there. He found her in the aisle already near the exit and stopped in front of her. "Ms. Vasconcelos," he began, his voice more controlled than he felt inside. "If you'll allow me, I would like to accompany you to the terminal. I have something I need to say to you in person." Helena crossed her arms, a small smile of curiosity forming at the corner of her lips. "Sure, Commander. I'm listening." Renato hesitated for a moment. He wasn't a man accustomed to admitting faults, but he knew this wasn't just a matter of wounded pride. It was something bigger. "Today in the lobby I judged you without knowing you. It's an assumption based on nothing but my limited perception. I was wrong." He met her gaze, ensuring that his sincerity was evident. "But one thing I've learned in my profession is that any mistake we sweep under the rug can become a bigger problem in the future. So, I don't want to just ignore this. I want you to know that I recognize my mistake and I will make sure it doesn't happen again." Helena's gaze was impenetrable, evaluating every word spoken. Then, after a few moments of silence, she slightly tilted her head and replied, "Commander, acknowledging a mistake is already an important step, but true learning lies in change. I will be watching." She turned and walked down the airplane steps, without saying anything more. Renato stayed there for a few seconds, watching her walk with her unwavering posture. He didn't know if that meant forgiveness, but he knew that the only way to prove his evolution would be through his actions. And for the first time in a long time, he felt determined to do things differently. In the days that followed the flight, Renato couldn't get Helena's words out of his mind. It was rare for him to allow himself to think so much about a situation that in practice was already resolved. But something inside him was not satisfied. Acknowledging a mistake was just the first step, and he knew that the way he had always viewed the world needed to change for real. Back at the base, while waiting for the schedule of the next flights, Renato began to pay more attention to the interactions around him. He noticed how other colleagues, even if unconsciously, treated some passengers differently. Small gestures, glances, tones of voice that had previously gone unnoticed. That bothered him more than he would like to admit, as he realized he had done that so many times without noticing. The following week, he received confirmation of a new international flight. To his surprise, among the passengers was Helena Vasconcelos. It was as if the universe was offering him a second chance, and he didn't intend to waste it. When he arrived at the private airport terminal, he was the first to recognize her. Helena wore an elegant, understated outfit, as always. Upon noticing his presence, she merely raised an eyebrow, showing no surprise. Renato approached with a firm posture and greeted her politely. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Vasconcelos. The plane is ready, and the crew has prepared everything to ensure your maximum comfort during the flight." Helena evaluated his words for a brief moment before responding. "It's good to know, Commander. I see you're making a point of showing professionalism." Renato held her gaze and nodded. "More than that, ma'am. I'm striving to change the way I see things." This time, Helena seemed genuinely interested. A slight smile appeared at the corner of her lips. Bios, but she didn't comment. She simply walked towards the boarding area, leaving in the air the feeling that she was testing whether her words were true. The takeoff went smoothly. During the flight, Renato made sure to pass through the main cabin to ensure everything was perfect. As he approached Helena, she was intently reading a document but noticed his presence and looked up. "Are you here to check if I'm comfortable, Commander?" she asked, a subtle tone of provocation in her voice. Renato smiled, maintaining his composure. "Part of my job is to ensure that all passengers have an impeccable experience. But in your case, Ms. Vasconcelos, I also want to know if you still believe I can learn something." Helena closed the document and rested her hands on the table. "Learning never ends, Commander. But I must admit I'm curious to see how far your change goes." Her response confirmed that he was still under observation, that she was still waiting for proof. And Renato knew that well-crafted words weren't enough. Action was necessary. At the end of the flight, when the passengers disembarked, Helena paused for a moment beside Renato, who was accompanying her to the exit. "Commander, if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that character is measured by actions, not regrets. We'll see where your actions lead you." Renato nodded. "I hope to a better place than where I've been before." Helena smiled faintly and went on her way. At that moment, Renato realized that true change wasn't about a single episode or a well-crafted apology. It was a daily commitment, and he was willing to honor it. The days following that flight felt different for Renato. He began to notice details he had previously ignored, small moments that reflected not just his change, but the impact his actions had on those around him. In every interaction with passengers, his demeanor shifted. He started to observe more closely, to listen more than just judge. A few weeks later, he received a notification for a new international flight, and when reviewing the passenger list, a familiar name caught his eye: Helena Vasconcelos. This time Renato felt something different. It wasn't fear or discomfort, but a quiet anticipation. He wanted to show that his change was not temporary. On the day of boarding, he arrived earlier, at the airport. The terminal was busy, and Helena, as always, remained discreet. When she approached the boarding counter, Renato took the initiative. "Good afternoon, Ms. Vasconcelos. Your cabin is already prepared, and everything has been checked to ensure a comfortable flight." Helena paused for a brief moment and looked at him with interest. "What careful attention, Commander. I see you are putting in the effort." Renato smiled slightly, not breaking his gaze. "I've learned that details make a difference, and that recognizing our mistakes, is not enough if there is no real change." She nodded, accepting his answer without words, and headed for boarding. During the flight, Renato made a point of personally checking that everything was in order. When he stopped next to Helena, she looked at him expectantly. "I need to know." "Commander," she started, setting aside the book she was reading, "what exactly prompted this reflection of yours?" Renato took a deep breath before responding. "It was your candidness, the fact that you showed me something I didn't see in myself. I've always considered myself a competent professional, but I realized that competence is not enough when empathy is lacking." Helena watched him closely before smiling almost imperceptibly. "An interesting answer. And what do you intend to do with this new perspective?" Renato adjusted his posture, keeping his voice steady. "To apply it. Not only here, but in every space I can. Because I realized that small actions can change lives. I was stuck in a cycle of automatic judgments, but now I choose to see beyond appearances." She nodded, satisfied. "If you are sincere about this, Commander, then you're on the right track." The flight continued without incidents, and when they landed, Helena didn't exit immediately. Instead, she waited for Renato to come closer, before speaking again. "Commander, real changes happen in day-to-day life." "I will keep observing." Renato smiled, understanding what she meant, "and I will continue to prove that I can be better." She gave him one last evaluating look, and then went on her way, disappearing into the busy terminal. But Renato knew that this was not a goodbye. It was just another step in his journey of transformation. Renato watched Helena vanish among the passengers in the airport terminal, but this time, instead of feeling uncertainty, he felt a calm certainty settling within him. The transformation he had started was not just to please an influential client, but something he truly believed in: Each small gesture, each change in his conduct, was a reflection of the growth he had been experiencing. Months passed, and with each flight, Renato noticed how his approach influenced not only his passengers, but also his crew. He now made a point of getting to know better those who worked with him, understanding their stories, and treating everyone with the same respect and professionalism. The man who once quickly judged people based on appearances was now seeking to understand and learn from those around him. Then, on an apparently ordinary day, a new international flight appeared on his schedule. When checking the passenger list, he saw Helena Vasconcelos' name again. This time, however, her name was not the only one catching his attention. Next to it, another familiar name was listed, Ricardo Vasconcelos, her husband. Renato felt a slight unease. He didn't know much about Helena's personal life, but for some reason imagined that this flight could bring a new test for him. On the day of boarding, he waited with the crew in the lobby, as he now did by habit. When Helena arrived, accompanied by a man with an equally strong presence, Renato immediately noticed that Ricardo shared the same imposing demeanor as his wife. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Vasconcelos, Mr. Vasconcelos," he greeted with a slight smile. "The plane is ready to welcome you." Helena gave him an appraising look, a discreet smile appearing at the corner of her lips, while Ricardo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "So this is the famous Captain Renato," said Ricardo, his voice laden with curiosity. "Helena told me some stories about you." Renato maintained his professional posture, but felt a twinge of apprehension. He knew Helena was a demanding woman, and if she had talked about him to her husband, it could only mean two things. Either she was impressed by his change, or she still expected him to prove his worth. "I hope they were good stories," Renato replied, keeping a neutral tone. Helena chuckled softly. "Only the ones that matter." During the flight, Renato kept his usual professionalism, but noticed that Helena and Ricardo were watching him more closely than usual. In a moment of calm, he was called to the main cabin. When he entered, Helena and Ricardo were seated side by side, both with evaluative expressions. "Captain, tell me," Ricardo began, crossing his arms, "what makes a good leader?" Renato blinked, surprised by the unexpected question. He looked from Helena to Ricardo, and then answered calmly, "A good leader doesn't impose authority, but inspires respect. He not only gives orders, but also listens and learns, and above all, knows how to recognize when he is wrong and strives to improve." Ricardo nodded slowly as if considering each word. Then he looked at Helena and smiled. I think he understood the lesson. Helena returned the smile and turned her gaze to Renato. "You passed the test, Captain." Renato frowned slightly, confused. "There was a test?" Helena chuckled softly. "There is always a test, Captain. And you handled yours very well." Ricardo extended his hand to Renato, who shook it firmly. "My wife has a keen eye for identifying character, and I can say she rarely makes mistakes. I'm glad to see she was right about you." Renato smiled, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't just a professional approval, it was a confirmation that he had truly changed. And more than that this change had a real impact. As they landed, Helena said goodbye with a firm look, and words that he knew carried a deeper meaning than they seemed. "Good luck, Captain. May you continue proving to yourself that you can be better every day." Renato turned to her. He was about to disappear into the lobby, this time with the certainty that his journey was just beginning. But now he faced her differently, because now he knew exactly which path he wanted to take.